Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome back to Climate Voters Tonight. I'm your host, Peter Schleisman, and we have got a great program for you today. First, we're going to turn to the House of Representatives and learn about all the different bills they've been trying to move through the chamber. Then we'll go out west to learn about the complicated dynamics of water resources. And then, last but not least, we'll learn about sustainable aviation in an interview with Mark Brownstein, SVP of Energy Transition for EDF and EDF Action. But first, let's turn to the headlines. President Biden last week stood up for clean air, vetoing a bill by those in Congress wanting to keep dirty trucks on the road. His action keeps in place important protections to limit the amount of harmful tailpipe pollution. This pollution exposes everyone to risk, but the health harms fall most heavily on Black and Latino communities because major highways and trucking routes are more likely to be located near them. I'd like to thank everyone who made their voice heard in the latest EPA rule to limit climate pollution from heavy-duty trucks. We delivered more than 7,600 supportive comments from EDF and EDF Action members to EPA's doorstep Friday. Now, let's do it again. EPA is now seeking comments on new limits on climate pollution from passenger vehicles and light-duty vehicles. The comment period closes July 5th. Join us in advocating for the strongest possible rule by going to edfaction.org/LDV. We're excited to share an important update on recent primary elections in Virginia. Just last week, Virginia voters turned out to select their party's nominee for local races from district supervisor to the General Assembly. These are the candidates that are going to be vying for the seats in November. On a local level, climate champion Andres Jimenez won his primary for Mason District Supervisor in Fairfax County, Virginia. EDF Action members knocked on doors for Jimenez because he is a true climate champion. He spent his career working in the environmental movement, including leading an environmental nonprofit, Green 2.0. Previously, Jimenez also worked for Citizens Climate Lobby and Ocean Conservancy. While we spend a lot of time talking about national politics, these local races matter. They matter because this is where so many local decisions are made that truly impact how our communities. These local offices not only make decisions on how to spend federal and state resources, but also offer services and pass their own initiatives that will impact our day-to-day lives. Check out the tweet in the comments to learn more. And now a plug for our friends at the podcast Degrees, real talk about planet-saving careers. This is a great resource for anyone looking to bring their professional skills to the climate movement. The podcast's latest series, called The Year of the Climate Job, helps people transition into climate careers. Tune in on Apple or Spotify and share this podcast with your network. Now on to our first story. Clean energy manufacturing is booming across the U.S. This wave of activity was set in motion when President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. In just a few months, it has created more than 142,000 jobs across the country. Sounds like good news to me. Yet, House extremists don't think so. They are scheming every day to stop this progress and protect the interests of polluters. Just look at last week. First, they passed the RAINS Act, which would give Congress the ability to effectively prevent federal agencies from implementing environmental health and safety protections rooted in science. This could lead to even more gridlock on the Hill. Then they passed SOPRA, which also guts federal agencies' ability to protect the public. That's because it would allow judges to reverse decades of established precedent, substituting their own policy interpretations for agencies' expert determinations. Third, the House Ways and Means Committee passed a bill that would gut the critical clean energy incentives benefiting consumers and businesses. They are also trying to scrap an important program to clean up contaminated sites that harm the health of nearby communities. And now this week, the House Appropriations Committee is considering bills that would slash funding by over 30% for some agencies trying to implement the Clean Energy Plan and confront the climate crisis. Let's be clear, there are competing visions in Washington. One will reduce harmful pollution, improve our health, make us more energy secure, and heal the planet. The other will keep us dependent on dirty fossil fuels. Help us in this fight by going to edfaction.org/climate progress to tell your representative to support climate progress. Moving on. Communities across the Southwest continue to feel the effects of a rapidly intensifying water crisis. As climate change redefines normal precipitation patterns, the region's two main sources of water are at risk of drying up. Last episode, we talked about one of them, rivers. You'll recall that Nevada, California, and Arizona reached an agreement recently to reduce use of the Colorado River and prevent it from reaching catastrophically low levels. Tonight, we turn our attention to the region's other source of water, the ground. Well, really, the underground. You see, while the shrinking Colorado River garners national headlines, the plurality of Arizona's water supply, 41%, actually comes from wells that pump groundwater stored in aquifers. Think large storage containers of water, according to the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. And while this precious resource is managed by the state in some places, like Phoenix and Tucson, the situation in rural Arizona is essentially still the Wild West. Rural Arizona comprises over 80% of the state's land area and is home to over 1.5 million people. That's about the population of West Virginia. And it's the only area in the entire 7-state Colorado River Basin where groundwater pumping is still allowed at unlimited levels. With almost no oversight and decades of overuse, residents are finding it harder and harder to manage the water they have left. One community in the southeastern corner of the state took the extraordinary step of writing directly to the governor this April, asking for the state to step in and protect the Wilcox groundwater basin, one of the most threatened in Arizona. Much like a personal checking account, groundwater reservoirs can be overdrawn when the amount of water that gets pumped out is greater than the natural or constructed recharge. In Wilcox, this water is being pumped out 5 to 8 times faster per year than it can be replenished. Overall irrigation for farms in the area has increased by over 50% in the past 25 years. As a result, many residents have had to deepen the wells for their homes at their own expense. Some community members who can't afford to have been forced to move elsewhere. While pinning a well's decline on one source is virtually impossible, the sinking of the area's aquifer accelerated after one company, Riverview LLP, bought and expanded a mega dairy 10 miles north in January 2015. Riverview has now drilled nearly 80 new wells, most at least 1,000 feet deep, and 3 close to 2,600 feet deep. Many other new well drillers have also sunk a straw into the aquifer in the last several years. Another example of groundwater depletion comes from La Paz County, Arizona, where 2 Saudi Arabian-owned farms are siphoning groundwater and leaving neighboring wells dry. These farms, which are leased through a company called Fondomonte Arizona, are growing water-thirsty alfalfa on thousands of acres of land, all for export to feed cows and horses in the Middle East. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays recently announced that Fondomonte's permits had been revoked. But without the right protections, rural areas like Wilcox and La Paz County are still faced with a literal free-for-all on water and no way to plan for a secure water future. Those with the deepest pockets and the deepest wells are increasingly the only ones able to survive. Yes, we need water-efficient farming in the region as part of the domestic production to help feed our families, but this must be balanced by managing the other water needs of communities, many of them rural and dependent on sustainable agriculture. So, what can we do? Most importantly, it's time for the state to bring an end to the Wild West of water. Local communities like Wilcox and La Paz County need action by the state legislature and governor to enact a law that provides tools and resources to protect their groundwater. These could include incentives like funding for groundwater recharge or other water conservation projects, and sensible regulations to prevent overuse. The water crisis won't disappear overnight. Arizona's failure to manage groundwater in rural areas demonstrates the depth of the issue and the urgency it demands. But it's not just an Arizona problem. The truth is, elected officials and communities in many parts of the West are dealing with groundwater depletion. While other states have some protections in place, in general, the rules don't do enough to provide water security for people and the environment. So we need you to continue to draw awareness to the need to conserve and manage water resources. If you want to submit a letter to the editor, please email us at volunteer@edfaction.org, and we can connect you to resources that will help highlight your perspective in your local paper. No issue is more important to the future of Arizona and the rest of the West than water. Moving on. Now we're going to turn to a brand new topic, sustainable aviation fuels. To give you a deep dive into the topic, I sat down with EDF and EDF Action's own Mark Brownstein, Senior Vice President of Energy Transition. All right, let's go ahead and take a look.
Brownstein, Senior Vice President for Energy Transition at EDF, to talk about how we can make the aviation industry more sustainable. Mark leads EDF's energy program globally, and he's focused on finding ways to halt the rise of global oil and gas emissions on a path consistent with a 2050 zero carbon future. Thank you so much for being here, Mark.
It's great to be here, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. So let's just jump right into this interview. Can you tell us a little bit about the current fuel that the aviation industry uses and how does it impact climate?
Well, as people might suspect, aviation fuel comes from oil. And of course, oil is a major source of greenhouse gas pollution. Oil is also a major source of air pollution, right? And so every time we make a decision to fly for business or for pleasure, we're having a major impact on the climate. We're also having a major impact on health, on public health, people who live in and around airports around the world. So for both of these reasons, we really want to try to find alternatives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that a lot of people, myself included, felt a little bit cooped up during the pandemic and would like to get out and explore the world. So it really is critical that we find some alternatives that allow us to enjoy our interests, but also protect our climate and people's health. So on that note, I mean, what are the alternatives? Are there any decent alternatives that we can look into?
Well, certainly you know right off the bat, right? I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that at least insofar as business is concerned, there's a lot of things that we can do without having to get on an airplane. The technology does allow us to talk to each other and conduct a business without having to go through all the time and expense of working our way through an airport and getting on an airplane. And so one strategy, of course, is to make better use of the technologies that now have come into an existence that allow us to do those things. But it's also fair to say the pandemic has taught us another important lesson, which is there's really no substitute for seeing people in person. All those family occasions that we spent gathered around the screen rather than gathered around the table sort of reminded us of the fact that getting together with friends and family who live in other parts of the country or other parts of the world is really important. And so while we want to do what we can to minimize the amount of flying that we do, I personally think that the ability to travel is a good thing. It allows us to be with people that we love. It allows us to interact with people of different cultures and different nationalities around the world. And frankly, we need a little more of that these days. And so those are all the good reasons to travel. And so we want to make sure that we get to do that, but we do it in a way that's responsible for the climate and responsible for the environment.
Absolutely. So is there anything that the Biden administration is doing as we speak to support the adoption of more sustainable aviation fuels? And if so, how does that connect to the clean energy plan that we adopted last Congress?
Yeah, so maybe take a step back and talk about sustainable aviation fuels. So, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, right, today we get all of our jet fuel from oil, and that's, hydrocarbons that we pull out of the ground. There are technologies that allow us to manufacture jet fuel from plants called biofuels. There are technologies that allow us to engineer fuels by combining hydrogen with carbon dioxide, carbon that we can extract either from industrial processes or even from the atmosphere where we've already dumped a lot of it. In both cases, these technologies are available to us. They're more expensive today than continuing to manufacture oil, jet fuel from oil, but they are available to us. And as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration was able to develop a set of tax incentives to help make these new alternative forms of fuel more competitive with their oil-based, with their oil-based alternatives. So on the one hand, that's a good thing, right? Because we want to develop these alternatives. But as it turns out, these alternatives can themselves lead to some important climate and environmental problems if they're not done right. And that's really where we need to focus.
That's interesting, and that leads right into my next question. What are the risks in promoting these fuels? You talk about how some of these fuels might actually worsen the problem. How does that work, and what are those risks?
Well, let's talk about fuel that comes from plants, biofuels. So on the one hand, plants are a renewable resource. You harvest them and then you can replant them, and that's part of what makes biofuels so attractive. But they're not so attractive, right? If you are plowing under rainforests in order to grow more plants to turn into fuel. That's a step backwards in terms of climate protection because rainforests are such a big carbon sink. It's also really a bad consequence for the people, the indigenous people who depend on those rainforests for their livelihood. So that's a negative. Or using food-based crops like corn or soybeans to manufacture fuel at exactly the moment when we're seeing more and more areas of the world go into food deficits, in part because of climate change. So the idea that we would take food crops and turn them into jet fuel rather than use them to feed people is also pretty objectionable, right? So these are two ways in which good intention, right, finding alternatives to oil-based fuels, but if done wrong, can actually lead to some pretty bad consequences.
That makes sense. That is interesting. So clearly, we got to do better. We have to have some sort of a strategy for sustainable aviation fuels. But as we talked about, there are some serious risks that are involved. How can we get it right?
Well, getting it right means paying attention to the science, right? Understanding when a strategy is actually making a positive contribution to the climate versus one that's making a negative contribution to the climate, right? Plowing under rainforest, negative contribution to the climate. So first of all, getting, what we call the life cycle accounting correct. The second is making sure that the alternatives that we're embracing are not just protective of the climate, but they're also protective of ecosystems and the health of communities. That they don't come with unnecessary air toxins, for example, that make emissions from airplanes worse, or that are emissions associated with producing the fuel. And again, all of that is having good science, understanding what those toxins are, and what the chemical processes and industrial processes are that turn the feedstock into fuel, and making sure that those are well managed so that you minimize those toxins. So those are some of the ways in which we think about positive steps that we can take to generate the alternatives that we need, but without the negative consequences that clearly we don't want.
Right. Well, is there anything else that our viewers should know about this issue?
Well, I think it's really important that folks understand the need for alternatives, but also understand that not all alternatives are created equal. I myself am actually a frequent flyer. I do a lot of flying for the work that I do, because as I said earlier, sometimes there's just no substitute for personal interaction, right? So much of the work we do here at Environmental Defense Fund is engaging with a diverse set of stakeholders to help them understand the science and the need for change. And frankly, a lot of that work requires the interpersonal communication that is the foundation of trust. So I do a lot of traveling myself. And when I get on an airplane, and I often fly United Airlines, they market themselves as embracing the green revolution, and they market themselves as embracing alternative fuels, sustainable aviation fuels. But from my work at Environmental Defense Fund, I know that not everything that they're purchasing actually would meet our definition of what a sustainable aviation fuel is. Now, I do a lot of work in this space, so I get that. But what I need from all of you out there, right, is all of you to understand these issues as well, and be able to call your aircraft, your air carrier of choice, right, on their claims, and really hold them accountable. We want them to purchase sustainable aviation fuels, but we really want them to make sure that they truly are sustainable. So we'll continue to try to do what we can to educate all of you out there as to what the right paths are. And then we're really hoping that you all will engage when you make your own choices about when and where to fly, to hold your air carriers accountable for making the best choices that they can and should be making.
So next time our viewers are watching the in-flight movie, let's make sure that they understand what the advertisement that pops up before it is really saying, and what the science is actually telling us.
Yeah, and perhaps when you get off that flight and they send you the little email afterwards saying, how did we do, right? How was our customer service? Well, maybe your customer service was fine, but maybe you want to ask them a question about the fuel that they were using to power your flight.
Exactly. Write them a note. I love that. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Mark. This was really fascinating. I'm actually in Minnesota this week visiting family. So I was just on a plane a couple days ago. I'll be on a plane back to DC in a couple of days. So yeah, visiting family, traveling, it's absolutely important part of our world. Let's get this right. Let's make sure that we can do it into the future.
Fill out that customer survey. They want to know how they're doing.
Delta's gonna hear from me. Absolutely. And it's not just going to be about the cookies.
Good.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter. Enjoyed it.
All right, what an informative conversation that was with Mark. The good news is we'll continue the conversation about how to make air transit more sustainable, and we will keep you updated with any and all actions that you can take in the months ahead. Before we sign off for the evening, a quick reminder that Climate Voters Tonight will be taking the week off of July 4th, and we will be back on July 20th. Thank you so much for tuning in. Climate Voters Unite.